Across 2,000 miles of mountains, deserts and plains, a people moved like shadows through the landscape, the Apache. Their name alone conjures images of fierce warriors and untamed lands, but their true story runs far deeper. From the frozen prairies of Canada to the sun-scorched valleys of the Southwest, they migrated, adapted, and endured against impossible odds. This is not a story of conquest, it is a story of survival. Apache bands split and reunited across centuries, carrying their songs, their ceremonies, and their memory through forced relocations and cultural erasure. What they refused to abandon: their language, their baskets, their dances became acts of resistance. The land remembers them. The songs still echo. If a people can lose everything but their identity, what does that tell us about what truly cannot be taken away? Apache linguistic roots trace to the Athabascan language family, a tapestry of languages that threads through the northern forests and plateaus from Alaska to the Canadian plains and beyond. And from there, threads of speech slipped southward, taking shape in the high deserts and rocky mesas of what would become the American Southwest. The Apachean branch, a subset of this vast family, carries within it voices that would become distinct in their own right, yet always recognizably kin to the languages that echo through the rivers of the northern interior. The sound of a syllable, the rhythm of a word, the consonants that bite into the quiet of the evening all point to a shared origin, even as they diverge into the unique dialects and expressions that define Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and the Plains groups in later chapters of history. Linguistic ties run deep, and through them the past speaks of migrations, of contact, of adaptation, and of a people finding a home in landscapes that would test the endurance of any community. Migration patterns from Canada to the American Southwest unfold like a slow, patient river, its course charted not by sudden bursts but by gradual shifts of movement and settlement, by the quiet reoccupation of new places as old ones shifted beneath the feet of the people. The earliest traces lie in the way languages drift across the landscape, a mouthful of syllables that migrates from wooded highlands toward arid valleys, then branches outward along the foothills and canyons. Archaeological evidence, though cautious and sometimes fragmentary, speaks of a procession of seasonal camps and transportive routes, of families moving with the seasons, of game trails that become thoroughfares for newcomers, and of rock shelters that hold the whispers of a people learning to live with scarce water, with sand that shifts like a living thing, and with horizons that never quite surrender their secrets. The timeline slides slowly, with milestones that researchers place somewhere between the late medieval period and the early modern era, a window perhaps opening around the centuries before contact with Europeans, when the Southwest began to crystallize as a home for communities who would later be broadly identified as Apache. Within this long arc, the formation of distinct Apache bands emerges as a natural expression of adaptation to diverse environments. The foothills and canyons of the mountains toward the north and east gave rise to Western Apache communities who learned to read the weather in the hum of cedar and fir, who hunted in the forest margins and traded with neighbors across broad landscapes. To the southeast, where arroyos carve the land and heat lies in the air with a steady, almost patient weight, Chiricahua bands emerged, moving between green passes and desert lowlands, weaving a network of camps that could endure long treks and times of scarcity. Mescalero communities settled around the springs and pine forests of the southern mountains, their camps shaped by the rhythm of seasons and the abundance of highland flora. Jicarilla bands, tied to the river valleys and the high plains of northern New Mexico, crafted a life from the pulse of streams and the gifts of the plains, while Lipan communities traced a path toward the grasslands of the southern plains and into what would later be understood as Texas borderlands, their movements reflecting a flexible response to mobility and collaboration with neighboring groups. And the plains groups, flowing from the wider Lipan lineage into the broader plains, carried with them a suite of practices that could adapt to open country, wind, and distant water sources, a testament to the adaptability baked into Apache memory. Early social structure and family organization in Apache communities rested on networks of kin, households, and bands that moved with seasonal needs rather than a single center of authority, and within these networks leadership tended to emerge not from coercive command, but from the quiet respect afforded to elders who rid the land, understood the people, and could guide a group through lean seasons and long journeys. Families formed the core of daily life, with households often extending beyond the nuclear unit to include grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins who shared labor, resources, and story. The absence of centralized hierarchies did not mean a lack of social order. Rather, governance came through consensus within the band, with respected men and women whose experience, knowledge of terrain, and skill in negotiation earning deference. Elder councils met in the shade of cottonwood groves or around the flicker of a fire, not to command in an absolute sense but to advise, to interpret signs of weather and animal movement, to resolve disputes in ways that preserved cohesion, and to maintain a sense of continuity as families moved between sites across the turning wheel of the seasons. From the earliest days before contact, Apache cultural identities began to crystallize in the form of language, ritual practice, and a shared repertoire of survival knowledge that bound communities together and set them apart from others who would later share the desert and leached water sources. The language carried within it memories of places, of trails, of the way a child learned to listen to the wind and to identify the tracks of a deer resting in the shade. The material culture carried the signs of adaptation, crafts wrought from plant fibers, hides, and raw pigments. The design of tools that could be carried across long treks, and the clothing that offered protection against sun, wind, and cold. In these ways, Apache identity grew from the patient labor of living with the land, from the subtle knowledge that seasons impose and water grants, and from a quiet endurance that becomes a central thread in the story of a people who would endure great change and maintain a steady, unhurried sense of themselves. The development of a unique Apache cultural identity before European contact was a slow but persistent process, a tapestry woven from language, environmental mastery, social memory, and ritual practice. The stories told around the fire, the ceremonial songs that traveling singers shared at seasonal gatherings, the beadwork that captured the color of the desert dawn, and the patterns of movement that kept families connected through vast stretches of terrain. All these elements contributed to an identity that would endure through centuries of challenge. In the absence of written records, memory and practice became the archive, and the landscape itself, its canyons, mesas, and river bends, acted as a living book in which the people could read the world, and in reading, discern a path for living with it. Thus, origins and early history, while anchored in the long-ago past, remain a living line of descent, a continuous thread that links the first chapters to what would come much later, when contact with others would press new questions, invite new negotiations, and invite new forms of resilience to be learned and shared across generations. The Western Apache, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan, and Plains branches emerge as distinct branches of a shared tree, each occupying a corridor of land and a pattern of life that speaks to a particular corner of the Southwest and beyond, while keeping a kinship that binds them in memory and practice. Across the arid and mountain landscapes, these groups lay out a map of territorial distribution whose edges shift with the seasons and with the tides of history, a map that defines not only space but the rhythms of life, hunting grounds, seasonal camps, water sources, and trading routes that echo through the decades. The Western Apache trace a route through the forested high country and onto the desert fringe, where valleys offer refuge and springtime green returns with a patient regularity. Chiricahua bands thread through the sun-baked hills of southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, moving with the heat and embracing distance as a resource, not a burden. Mescalero communities cluster around the cooler, pine-stitched highlands of southern New Mexico, a place where the air itself carries a hint of rain, and the soil bears the memory of cultivation. Jicarilla groups inhabit the northern reaches of New Mexico, where river corridors carve the land into a network of shelter and sustenance, while Lipan communities trace their lines toward the plains and into Texas, noticing how water follows the land and how trade winds carry stories from one camp to another. The Plains Apache, a broader grouping connected to Lipan lineages, move with the open country, learning to read the land at distance, to shoot with accuracy toward targets that appear as mirages in the heat, and to keep a pace that respects both the land and the pace of the people who rely on it. Geographic distribution comes with a parallel set of cultural characteristics, yet within the broad family there are differences that arise from local environments, and from the contacts that each group maintains with neighbors. Western Apache bands share a common emphasis on forested country and the mountain corridors that feed the streams below, where cedar smoke, acorns, and game define a way of life that often centers on mobility between core settlements and more transient camps. Geronimo bands emphasize expanse and adaptability, moving along routes that cross borders and rivers, negotiating with neighboring groups and with the missions and soldiers who would come later. Mescalero communities reflect a weaving of mountain and desert life, where the Pine Coast and the Basin offer different resources at different times of year, inviting a seasonal pattern that blends pursuit of game with agriculture, gathered plants, and exchange. Geronimo groups ground their existence in river valleys and high plateaus, balancing a reliance on the land with a knowledge of how to navigate through canyons and through the seasonally changing flows of water. Lipan and Plains Apache communities show a versatile mobility, often bridging the spaces between plains and foothills, maintaining a flexible identity that can endure both drought and flood, wind and cold, and the arrival of new social and economic pressures from outside groups. Interrelationships and alliances between Apache bands reveal networks of kinship, marriage ties, reciprocal aid during lean times, and agreements around shared hunting and trading grounds. These relationships are negotiated through councils, through gifts, and through long-standing customary laws that help maintain peace and continuity across generations. Population estimates throughout history for the Apache bands remain approximate, as many communities experienced fluctuations in response to drought, disease, and external pressures. Yet the pattern remains clear. The bands maintain distinct identities rooted in place and practice, while preserving a flexible, cooperative stance that could accommodate alliances, trade networks, and occasional periods of shared defense when external forces pressed from the outside. In the slow light of dawn, Apache spiritual beliefs reveal a cosmos where human life is connected to a larger fabric of beings, forces, and natural cycles, where every river, animal, and plant bears a presence that can be honored or overlooked, and where the human journey is a continuous dialogue with the land and its spirits. The world is scented with sage and cedar, with the dryness of a long afternoon, with the dust that rises and settles again, and with a sense that the sacred threads of life are woven into the daily acts of living. Religion manifests in practices that govern healing, protection, and guidance, often conducted by medicine people who carry knowledge of plants, songs, and prayer that align body, mind, and spirit with the needs of the community. The medical and spiritual disciplines are not separate civilizations but shared disciplines in which the same person might travel from patient care to ceremony with ease and authority, a testament to how integrated knowledge and ritual can be within Apache life. Gender roles and family structures reveal a balance of responsibilities that reflects the pragmatic needs of a desert and mountain environment. Women hold central roles in the domestic sphere, tending homes, gathering edible plants, preparing foods, and shaping the fabrics of family life through skills such as beadwork and other crafts that pass from generation to generation. Men often take on roles connected to hunting, scouting, and defense, moving across the land to bring back meat, to locate water, and to protect the family from threats that arise in a landscape that can be harsh and indifferent. Yet neither sphere operates in isolation, rather they complement each other in ways that keep families strong and communities intact. The coming-of-age ceremonies for girls mark transitions into adulthood, a passage celebrated with songs, teachings, and careful socialization that place girls among the stewards of memory and custodians of household knowledge. Young men undergo training in a different rite of passage that emphasizes endurance, skill, and responsibility, preparing them for roles as hunters, protectors, and navigators who can read the land and respond to the needs of others in the community. Traditional arts, crafts, and material culture express the intimate relationship between people and their environment. Basketry, weaving, and beadwork capture the colors of the desert, signaling identity and status, while serving functional needs in daily life. Clothing reflects the availability of resources, the climate, and the social expectations of different seasons and ceremonies, with buckskin and leather providing durability, and the use of natural dyes offering a palette drawn from the world around. Music, dance, and storytelling form a living curriculum that passes from elder to younger generations without the need for formal instruction, carried by singers and dancers who lend voice to history, memory, and myth, and who shape the aesthetic life of the community through a practice that remains both entertaining and instructive. In this way, Apache culture preserves a sense of continuity that travels with each season, each relocation of camp, and each passing of the years, allowing the people to maintain a distinct identity while remaining open to the changes that time and contact inevitably bring. Spiritual life resonates through ritual, song, and a shared sense of place that links ancestors with the living. Sacred spaces emerge in the landscape itself: sunlit mesas, hollows beneath cottonwood trees, and the banks of rivers where offerings are left and songs are sung, demonstrating how geography becomes a teacher, a memory, and a partner in ritual life. Ceremonies and songs do more than mark moments on the calendar. They provide a conduit for healing, a means of seeking guidance, and a language through which the community speaks to itself about its past, present, and future. The stories that travel through the generations, the myths that survive in whispered form, and the songs that echo across the desert meet at the intersection of memory and place, forming a spiritual map that remains stable even as the world around shifts in ways that no longer belong solely to a single people. The survival repertoire of the Apache is a testament to how a community can learn to read the land as a living entity, listening for the tells of animal movement, the patterns of wind and weather, and the subtle shifts in the landscape that signal change. Hunting techniques are sophisticated, drawn from a deep understanding of animal behavior, terrain, and water sources. The bow and arrow appear as a central tool, crafted with care, tuned for precision, and used in a way that respects both the quarry and the land that supports both hunter and hunted. The use of bolas, throwing sticks, and other devices demonstrates a versatility born of the need to adapt to different environments, from forested highlands to open desert valleys. The technology of weaponry reflects a pragmatic approach, tools designed to endure long journeys, to be carried by the body for easy access, and to maximize effectiveness in a variety of conditions. A hunter is also a tracker, reading footprints in the dust and recalling routes traveled on numerous previous occasions, a memory that extends into the broader strategic knowledge of the band. Military tactics reveal a tradition of patient, flexible, and terrain-informed warfare, focused on mobility, surprise, and the exploitation of environmental advantage. Apache strategies often prioritized raids, ambushes, and rapid maneuvers across the terrain, with a preference for avoiding large pitched battles that could drain scarce resources. The landscape itself dictates much of the approach. Canyons become corridors of concealment, plateaus offer high ground for vantage and warning, and rivers provide both obstacle and corridor for movement. Training of warriors from youth into adulthood involves a progressive development of skill, endurance, and discipline, with lessons learned from elders who have walked the land and observed the patterns of conflict that arise within it. The defensive side of warfare includes fortification techniques and the use of natural features as protective barriers, as well as the creation of temporary shelters and encampments that can be abandoned or defended as circumstances require. In this way, the warrior becomes not a solitary figure of aggression, but a part of a disciplined, cohesive unit whose strength lies in knowledge of place, timing, and joint action. Famous Apache leaders and their achievements appear in the annals as figures whose names evoke the memory of resistance and endurance. Cochise stands as a symbol of strategic patience, a leader who understood the value of cautious alliances, secure lines of retreat, and the protection of his people through careful negotiation as much as through force. Geronimo embodies endurance in the face of overwhelming pressure, a figure who navigated a world of shifting loyalties, external power, and internal resilience, with a quiet, unwavering determination. These leaders are not merely individuals but crystallizations of a broader culture, people who could interpret the land, orchestrate a collective response, and guide their communities through periods of upheaval with a steady hand and a deep sense of responsibility to those who walked beside them. Traditional hunting and gathering practices form a baseline for the Apache economy, a system built on intimate knowledge of the land, water, and seasonal abundance. Game animals, plant foods, and edible wild plants supply a diet that is both varied and resilient, with hunting camps and gathering sites shifting with the passage of seasons and the evolution of weather patterns. The agricultural methods of some Apache groups reflect a thoughtful adaptation to the landscape, with maize, beans, and squash cultivated in plots where water could be conserved and where soil could be renewed through careful farming techniques and crop rotation. These agricultural efforts did not eclipse the reliance on wild resources. Rather, they complemented the diet, enabling sedentary periods and providing a stable base from which communities could endure droughts and other pressures. Trade relationships with other tribes and settlers constitute a vital thread in the Apache economy, connecting distant camps through networks of exchange that carried goods, knowledge, and cultural influences. Beads, shells, pottery, cotton cloth, and dried meats moved along routes that intersected with neighboring groups, and later with European settlers, bringing with them new materials, ideas, and technologies that would be integrated into Apache life while preserving core practices and identities. Resource management and territorial control represent a practical response to the challenges of environment and abundance. The control of water sources, game-rich landscapes, and preferred camping grounds ensures a stable base from which communities can operate, while cooperation with neighboring bands and with other tribes around shared resources demonstrates a pragmatic approach to stewardship and negotiation. Adaptation to different environmental conditions is reflected in flexible settlement patterns, the ability to travel light or heavy depending on needs, and the capacity to prioritize essential resources as they become available or scarce, with the desert's memory teaching the people to read scarcity and abundance with equal attentiveness. Initial encounters with Spanish explorers and missionaries mark a turning point in Apache history, a moment when the spoken language of the land began to carry new echoes from across the sea and across the mountains. The first meetings occur in a world where trade would become more formal, where gifts and barter would grow into channels of exchange that shape relationships for generations. Early trading relationships emerge as a quiet aspect of these encounters, as Apache communities exchange hides, meat, baskets, and furs for basic goods, tools, and trinkets that inflame curiosity and invite new possibilities while testing limits and resilience. The introduction of horses stands as a transformative factor, turning the landscape into a wider arena of mobility, increasing the speed and reach of movement, and altering the balance of power in the region. The horse reshapes hunting patterns, enabling longer migrations and more expansive raids, but it also demands new codes of conduct, new methods of care for the animals themselves, and new economic and social structures built around the animal economy. Initial conflicts and peace treaties unfold in a slow, layered fashion, not as sudden shocks, but as a gradual rebalancing of power, negotiation, and adaptation. The exchange of cultural practices, techniques in metalworking, new forms of shelter, and different diplomatic strategies adds new textures to Apache life while testing the resilience of long-standing traditions. Cultural exchange and adaptation during this early contact period occur in ways that are both subtle and profound, shaping language, religion, and material culture as communities learn to negotiate coexistence, trade, and occasional conflict within a complex web of intergroup relationships. The narrative here is never simple or singular. It is a weave of small, patient steps toward a more interconnected world, one that would demand new skills, new alliances, and new ways of imagining the future as the land continued to reveal its many faces. Causes and catalysts of the Apache Wars spring from a convergence of factors: removal of traditional territories through external pressures, the allure of new markets and weapons, the disruption of established trade networks, and the broader geopolitical shifts that accompanied the westward expansion of settlements and state authority. Within this frame, major battles and campaigns unfold as a long, patient sequence of maneuvers and responses rather than a single climactic clash. Cochise and Geronimo stand as central figures, their lives closely tied to the land that defined their people's endurance, their leadership, a synthesis of strategic intent, intimate knowledge of terrain, and a capacity to sustain a community through years of conflict and displacement. Military strategies reflect a complex interplay of offense and defense, ambush, mobility, patience, and the constant calculation of risk and return in ways that exploit terrain and timing to offset disparities in numbers and equipment. The impact on Apache populations and territories follows a slow arc of decline in land and autonomy, interwoven with periods of renewed resistance and renewed negotiation. As the campaigns unfold, communities are forced to adapt to new forms of settlement, new political structures, and new expectations about what it means to live within the boundaries of other people's laws. The memory of these wars remains a quiet presence in the landscape and in the stories passed from elders to younger generations, a reminder of the price paid for resilience and a testament to the continuing capacity of Apache communities to endure. The establishment of Apache reservations marks a new regulatory environment in which the state assigns land use, appraises resources, and imposes schooling and religious instruction, framing daily life within a framework of federal policy that often collides with traditional practice. Living conditions on reservations are shaped by a blend of limited land, inadequate water, and the weight of bureaucratic demand, making daily tasks more challenging while also creating spaces for new forms of community organization and survival strategies. Government policies reflect a broader aim to assimilate, control, and reorient indigenous communities, yet resistance movements persist within the constraints, offering demonstrations of autonomy, pride, and the persistent desire to maintain tribal identity and governance. Adaptation within this era takes many forms, from quiet acts of cultural retention to more explicit strategies of resistance, as communities work to sustain languages, ceremonies, and crafts in the face of schooling regimes that often de-emphasize indigenous knowledge. Educational and religious influences arrive as double-edged swords, offering the tools for greater social mobility and political presence on the one hand, and on the other eroding the continuity of certain traditional practices if they are not integrated with care and purpose. The result is a complex tapestry in which Apache communities navigate a landscape of constraint and opportunity, seeking to preserve core elements of cultural identity while also negotiating for space to pursue modernization, to participate in new economic forms, and to exercise a greater degree of self-determination within the bounds of a federal system that continues to redefine the terms of governance, land ownership, and spiritual life. Concepts of health in Apache life emerge from a worldview in which balance, harmony, and relation define well-being as a state of alignment with the land, the community, and the spiritual world. Health and illness are read as aspects of a larger ecology, where the body, mind, and spirit require care and attention drawn from both natural remedies and ceremonial practice. The role of medicine, men and women, is central, guiding healing processes, diagnosing illness through observation and tradition, and guiding communities through ceremonies that address illness, misfortune, and the stresses of daily life. Traditional healing practices and ceremonies weave together plant use, ritual performance, and social support, aligning the patient with the environment in which healing takes place. Medicinal plants populate the landscape with practical and symbolic significance, and their uses span a wide range from soothing physical ailments to guiding spiritual protection and cleansing rites that restore harmony to the person and to the community. Integration of traditional and modern medicine appears as a dialogue rather than a collision, a process through which knowledge from both realms can coexist and inform each other. Traditional practitioners often work alongside medical professionals, sharing observations about remedies, patient needs, and patterns of illness that persist across generations. This synthesis is not a simple overlay, but a continuing negotiation of trust, expertise, and cultural meaning, seeking a path that honors ancestral knowledge while embracing the benefits of contemporary science. In this way, Apache healing practices remain a living, adaptive field that reinforces a sense of continuity and resilience at the heart of Apache life. Women in Apache society hold a central position in daily life, their influence extending across the domestic sphere, the economy, and the social sphere of leadership and governance. Their contributions to tribal leadership emerge not only in formal roles, but also through the quiet authority that guides households, manages resources, and determines the rhythms of family life. Traditional crafts and skills, textile work, beadwork, basketry, hide preparation, and the careful maintenance of clothing are expressions of women's knowledge and artistry, translating resourcefulness into beauty and functionality. Coming-of-age ceremonies for girls are important milestones that prepare young women for adult responsibilities, teaching them the responsibilities of care, governance within the family, and participation in community life. Throughout history, remarkable Apache women stand out as leaders, healers, teachers, and custodians of memory, their figures becoming threads within the broader fabric of Apache resilience and continuity. Traditional dwelling types and construction methods reveal a sophisticated adaptation to climate, terrain, and resource availability. Housing structures range from mobile shelter configurations that accommodate seasonal moves to more fixed, durable forms that reflect periods of stability within a camp or village. Seasonal housing patterns reflect a mobility that is not aimless but purposeful, aligning shelter with the most favorable conditions for water, food, and safety. The use of natural materials, wood, hide, earth, plant fibers, speaks to a reliance on local resources, and the architecture itself becomes a record of place, weather patterns, and the social life that moves through it. Sacred spaces and ceremonial structures emerge within the built environment, integrating ritual spaces with living quarters in ways that deepen the community's sense of place and continuity. Over time, Apache housing evolves with the neighbors around them, incorporating new techniques and sometimes new forms while preserving the functional core that allows people to live in harmony with their surroundings. Contemporary reservation life presents a landscape of both challenges and opportunities, where communities manage the tensions between preserving tradition and pursuing economic development, education, and political governance in a modern framework. Economic development and tribal enterprises become avenues for self-determination, enabling communities to own businesses, invest in infrastructure, and create a higher quality of life while still honoring cultural memory. Educational initiatives and cultural preservation programs work in concert to maintain language, arts, and ceremony as living traditions that can be passed to younger generations while integrating with the broader society. Tribal governance and sovereignty continue to define the political life of Apache nations as communities navigate the complexities of federal relations, state laws, and local governance structures to assert rights, protect resources, and plan for decades ahead. Current population and demographic trends show a people whose numbers have fluctuated through time, but who continue to adapt with a patient resilience, balancing tradition with modernization as they write new chapters in the long story of Apache nations. Traditional basketry and weaving techniques reveal a deep engagement with form, color, and function, where patterns and textures tell stories of landscape, memory, and identity. Pottery and ceramic traditions carry the imprint of region, resource, and technique, offering vessels that bear practical use and ceremonial significance. Clothing and personal adornment translate cultural meaning into visible signs of status, affiliation, and beauty, weaving together practical protection with aesthetic expression. Ceremonial objects carry symbolic weight, embodying beliefs, prayers, and social memory that connect generations through tangible, resonant forms. Contemporary Apache artists and artisans carry forward a living tradition, translating ancestral imagery into modern media, blending beadwork, sculpture, painting, and other forms to reach new audiences while honoring the old ways. Structure and variations of Apache languages reveal a framework of phonology, morphology, and syntax that underpins memory, storytelling, and social interaction. Storytelling traditions occupy a central place in Apache culture, transmitting history, lore, and moral lessons through generations of speakers who shape and refine narratives with each telling. Preservation efforts and language programs work to sustain these languages in the modern era, ensuring that the sounds of Apache speech continue to carry meaning for new listeners and new generations. Sacred songs and ceremonial language form a bridge between the mundane and the holy, a living repository of power and memory. The impact of language on cultural identity runs deep, anchoring a sense of belonging and continuity that helps communities navigate a world of change while remaining connected to their roots. Contributions to American history and culture emerge from a long arc of endurance, mobility, and cultural resilience. a record that includes linguistic innovations, ecological knowledge, and a capacity to adapt across centuries of upheaval. Current challenges facing Apache communities include land rights, resource management, language preservation, and economic development that respects sovereignty and tradition, alongside health, education, and access to opportunities that enable people to thrive. Cultural revitalization efforts intensify as communities seek to reclaim language, ceremonial life, and crafts that have faced pressures from outside forces, embracing new technologies and educational models while maintaining fidelity to tradition. Environmental and land rights issues tie the past to the present as Apache communities advocate for stewardship of land and water, a continuation of a long conversation between people and place about who may steward and benefit from the natural world. Future prospects for Apache nations depend on balancing the urgency of immediate needs with the slow, patient work of cultural renewal, legal advocacy, intergenerational learning, and the sustaining power of community to endure, adapt, and thrive. The story continues in this present moment, carried forward by memory, by practice, and by an enduring sense of belonging to a landscape that has long shaped and sustained the people who call it home. The mesas hold the morning in their stone shoulders, and the wind that passes over them writes an alphabet of patience on the old stories and the new ones being learned. In villages perched along the edge of the reservation, and in camps that drift with the seasons, people rise to tend the day the way they have tended it for generations, with hands that know the weight of a seed and the memory of a name attached to every creek bend. The day begins not with a single purpose, but with a chorus of purposes braided together to sustain language, to guard the water, to teach a child to listen as well as to speak, to honor the dead by living rightly in the land, and to imagine a future where the old and the new can walk side by side without one erasing the other. In the schools that thread through the communities, classrooms open not only with arithmetic and grammar, but with songs that travel from grandmother to granddaughter and back again through the line of living voices. The students learn to write in ways that honor both their ancestors and the modern tools that carry knowledge across distances. They draft digital archives of ceremonial songs, not as a novelty but as a living archive that those who come after can consult like travelers checking a map that always needs updating. The teachers speak of scholarship and stewardship in the same breath, because in these communities, education is not about extracting knowledge from a for-profit machine, but about shaping it with a care that mirrors the way a field is tended for harvest. The halls reverberate with the clack of keyboards and the soft thud of drum leather, and the two sounds merge into a rhythm that feels like rain on the desert, gratifying in its persistence and nourishing in its quiet insistence. The revival of language is not a single act but a sustained practice that travels across generations and across different kinds of spaces. A grandmother translates a family story from Apache into English and back again, the way a river shifts its course to follow the path of the fish that know where to gather. Young speakers gather at the edge of a courtyard after school, circling around a mentor who knows every intonation and tempo that gives a sentence its heartbeat. They rehearse greetings that stretch into long forms as if the language itself were a path that must be walked slowly to keep from stumbling. The children learn to recognize the coyote and the hawk not only as animals but as living kin whose calls inhabit certain words with a strength that cannot be summoned by a simple dictionary entry. In one room, a chalkboard is used to sketch a family tree whose branches are named in Nidi, in Mescalero, in Jicarilla, in Lipan, and in the other languages that the Apache communities keep like sacred maps. The act of writing becomes an act of remembering and an act of building, as if each letter laid down is a paddle stroke across a vast river of time. Technology appears on the scene not as a colonizer but as a tool that allows the people to do what they have always done, keep faith with place while learning how to navigate the wider world. A coder in a youth program builds a data visualization that shows the seasonal movements of plant life around a spring, linking phonology with festival calendars and with the numbers that describe the water level in a dammed river. Another student edits a documentary that compiles voices from elders who speak in the old language while the camera quietly records everything for posterity, ensuring that a lineage of memory can be accessed by someone who might be far away yet still belong. In kitchens lit by LED panels and warmed by the scent of chili and roasted corn, community organizers use video conferencing to connect a remote trading post with a regional language center, weaving commerce and culture together in a way that respects both the power of the marketplace and the sacredness of tradition. The point is not to replace ceremony with code, but to let code carry ceremony farther, to encode ritual into accessible formats that can travel beyond the canyon walls without losing their resonance. Water is spoken about as vividly as any elder. The rivers and streams that define Apache territory have long carried the memory of peoples who learned to live with the seasons, reading the layers of sediment as a librarian reads a shelf of books, knowing which page to turn when a flood comes, which lull in the flow signals a time to plant. The ongoing water rights conversations are nested within a wider fabric of life: orchards watered by runoff from snowmelt, fields planted with drought-resistant varieties that thrive where older crops once faltered, and a network of groundwater wells that supply medicinal herbs as carefully as they supply drinking water. People speak of the river not as a resource to be exploited, but as a relative, a living companion whose moods and tides require humility and cooperation. The pursuit of fairness in water allocation becomes a communal ritual that includes elders who know the ancient roots of irrigation, engineers who understand modern hydrology, and a generation that can imagine a compromise that preserves abundance for both people and the broader ecosystem. The rivers are mapped not merely in miles but in stories: the tale of a flood that carried a child to safety, the memory of a drought that taught restraint, the quiet joy when a spring emerges after a long winter. This knowledge is not static. Every season offers a revision, a chance to rebalance the relationship between human need and the river's willingness to share. Land rights occupy the foreground of the narrative in a way that feels both legal and spiritual. The legal mechanisms that determine who holds title to land, who can graze, who can harvest, who can lead a struggle or speak in a council, are navigated by those who know that the land is more than soil and rock. It is a chest in which the tribe stores its songs, its stories, its seeds, and its tremors of memory. Negotiations with federal agencies, state governments, and private interests unfold with a careful blend of courage and restraint. Some days bring small victories, a covenant that preserves a sacred site, a cross-tribal agreement on tribal sovereignty within regional land use plans, a commitment to collaborative management of forest resources, while other days test the patience and endurance that has kept Apache communities alive through centuries of pressure. The people understand that ownership is not simply something to be asserted in a courtroom. Ownership is a practice of stewardship, a moral claim backed by a track record of care for land, water, and air. When a protest arises, it does so not as a spectacle but as a continuation of a long tradition of speaking truth to power, a tradition that has survived by blending protest with program, resistance with responsibility, and speaking with listening. The stories of individuals weave into larger patterns, and the camera follows where they lead it, sometimes in quiet, intimate spaces, sometimes across sweeping landscapes where the wind seems to carry the echoes of long conversations. A young woman returns from college with a degree in environmental science and a zine in her backpack that features poems in Apache and English, a testament to layered identity that refuses to be flattened into a single label. She visits a council meeting in which elders, teachers, farmers, and students sit shoulder to shoulder, explaining how a new irrigation plan will affect a sacred spring, how a protective fence around an ancient cedar will help safeguard bats that roost nearby, how a rehabilitated wetland behind a recently rebuilt dam will support migratory birds that make the seasonal pilgrimage through the region. The council hears respectfully, and then the room settles into a rhythm of discussion that moves from disagreement towards shared solutions, a process that includes demonstrations of ecological knowledge, cost-benefit analyses, and appeals to cultural memory that remind everyone present of the land's living heart. In the arts, a lyric of resilience finds a formal shape that can be carried into schools, into galleries, into film festivals, and into international conversations about indigenous sovereignty and climate justice. A poet composes in a hybrid form, weaving English lines with Apache grammar and a rhythm drawn from drum beats and footwork dance. The lines speak of drought as a thief who takes the sweetness of fruit, of a canyon as a confidant who knows the names of every waterhole, of a child who learns to listen for a specific creak in the juniper wood that signals the right time to gather sage. A dancer rehearses a piece that traces the movement from birth to elderhood, a story told through steps that mimic the course of a river, each motion a vow to protect what feeds the clan's memory. In a gallery, a quilt unfurls across a wall, its patches stitched with beads and thread that hold the hues of the desert sky, each square telling a different chapter of survival and welcome to the future. The arts are not garnish. They are a fundamental language through which the community negotiates with the world it cannot ignore. Within the social sphere, elders continue to teach by showing up, which is to say they come to gatherings with their full selves, talking softly about patience, telling stories with a humor that disarms defensiveness, and offering wisdom without imposing it. The younger generation accepts this mentorship with a humility that comes from knowing that wisdom is not a possession but a practice, a membrane through which one's own life can pass on to the next generation without losing its own color. Families celebrate the births of new members, each child welcomed into a house where memory and innovation share a table, each plate a different tradition that has been braided into the next. When a baby first opens its eyes to the room, a grandmother hums a lullaby in Apache, and the laughter of siblings rings through the doorway like a promise that the circle will remain unbroken. Holidays and ceremonies shift with the times and the needs of the people, yet the core remains steady: the gathering, the song, the shared meal, the moment of collective breath before the next task begins. The healthcare story threads through the same fabric. As communities combine traditional healing practices with contemporary medicine, recognizing that wisdom rarely comes from a single source. Healers speak of plants gathered along the riverbank, their names tied to medicinal histories shared around a tea kettle, their uses carefully documented in language and in science. Clinics host patient navigators who help people traverse the sometimes labyrinthine world of insurance and appointments, while also offering rooms for talking circles where grief and gratitude mingle in equal measure. The approach to wellness is holistic, treating body and spirit as inseparable elements of a single human story. In the evenings, a nurse or a physician might sit in a living room, listening to a family's account of a long illness and offering care that respects the patient's preference for traditional remedies, or the community's sense that healing must occur not in isolation, but within a network of relationships that includes neighbors, teachers, and faith leaders. This is medicine that travels with the person through time, not a service that truncates a life by reducing it to a set of statistics. Economic life adapts without surrender. The markets that some communities find themselves near can be sources of both opportunity and pressure. Cooperative models arise, not as competitions for scarce resources, but as shared ventures that keep wealth within the community, while opening pathways for intertribal collaboration. A cooperative can be a farm where heirloom seeds are saved and exchanged, a crafts coop where beadwork and basketry move into fair trade and exhibition spaces, a digital media cooperative where youth curate content that travels across borders without losing the particular color of Apache voices. In such spaces, elders teach the old crafts at the same bench where younger people learn to design apps that map trails, track rainfall, or connect remote artisans with markets they could not reach alone. The economy is thus a weave rather than a ladder, many threads nourishing the same fabric, each thread respecting the integrity of the others, each thread contributing to the whole in a way that keeps the pattern from fraying. Ceremonial life continues to shape the daily rhythm of life in quiet but inexorable ways. The drums beat with a thunderous tenderness, a reminder that celebration and lament share a common ground, that joy and sorrow can travel together along the same line. The initiation rites, the seasonal ceremonies tied to planting and harvest, the remembrance of ancestors during vigils, all of these move through the year with a tempo that matches the ecological cycles of the land and the human life cycle. When a ceremony happens in the open air, the air itself becomes a participant, carrying the scent of juniper smoke and the sound of bells and the low murmur of spoken prayers that are both old and newly spoken. People who attend leave changed, even if gently so, because to be present at such a gathering is to witness a sacred continuity, a promise that what was once whispered on the wind continues to speak in the present tense. The future, then, is imagined not only as an unfolding of policy or a confrontation with the machinery of governance, but as a constellation of small daily acts of care. It rests on the ability to listen into the ground and into the air, into the mouths of children who demand to be heard in their own language, into the concerns of a grandmother who wants her grandchildren to know the river as a living friend. It rests on the stubborn patience that has kept a people alive when the odds were long and the hour late. It rests on courage in the face of uncertainty and a willingness to accept that sometimes the most radical act is to stay and tend, to keep watering the seed even when the harvest seems far away. And yet there is a palpable sense of momentum, a growing confidence that the long work of cultural renewal is not a footnote to history, but a living author of the present, a chapter in which the Apache people write themselves into the future, not as objects of pity or as backward relics, but as full subjects with a rightful claim to voice, to land, to water, to technology, and to joy. As the planet warms and waters rise in new forms, the Apache communities lean into resilience with a practical grace that comes from long acquaintance with hardship. They learn to adapt the old ways to new tools without surrendering the essential ethics that have always guided them: hospitality to strangers who come in peace, steadfast protection of the vulnerable, reverence for life in all its stages, and an insistence that freedom includes the right to preserve one's own language, stories, and ways of knowing. The story is not a singular arc towards triumph or tragedy. It is a mosaic in which each person, each family, each village contributes a tile that, when placed beside others, reveals a map of a living culture that refuses to disappear. The map is never complete, and that is precisely its vitality, for it invites the next generation to find a new line through the landscape, to redraw a boundary that honors the old ways while offering fresh routes for future travelers. Along the road between towns and homes, you will hear the many voices that compose this living chorus. An elder recounts a memory of a flood years ago when a child was saved by the quick instinct of a family who knew the shoreline, not as a hazard but as a guide. A young teacher speaks of a project that pairs language preservation with coding, a blend of tenderness and precision that shows how two seemingly distant worlds can nourish each other. An artisan presses beads into a pattern that encodes a story, each bead a syllable in a language that has endured through centuries because there are people who choose to say it aloud every day. A farmer explains a plan to restore a wetland that will shelter waterfowl while also providing irrigation for crops, a living compromise that honors both utility and beauty. A DJ in a community center spins a track that layers a drum loop with a recording of a lullaby in Apache, so that younger listeners simultaneously hear the pulse of modern rhythm and the echo of ancestral lullabies, the soundscape itself, a bridge between what has been and what will be. To watch this story is to see a culture in dynamic conversation with itself and with the world. It is a story about continuity and change, about the stubborn endurance of memory and the inventive spark of invention, about land, water, language, and the people who hold them in trust. It is a story without a final page, because the land itself is a living text that continues to be read, reinterpreted, and expanded by those who walk it and by those who listen from afar and learn to speak with a gentle, steady voice. The Apache, in their many nations and communities, carry forward a tradition that is less about resisting time than about guiding time gently through a passage where tradition and transformation walk hand in hand, neither conquering the other, both enriching the life of a people who insist that belonging to a place means more than residence. It means responsibility, reciprocity, and a shared vow to treat the world as a patient teacher and a generous kin. And so the chapter does not end. It folds into the next moment, the next gathering, the next song, the next map drawn on a hillside, the next breath drawn in a circle that gathers everyone who loves this land and this people into a single, continuing story. The land does not yield its secrets easily, and yet for those who have learned to listen, there is a cadence in the wind that speaks as plainly as a drum or a voice raised in a circle. It moves through canyons where stone steps disappear into shadow, across plains where the grasses rustle in a language older than record-keeping and newer than the memory of the first leaf. The Apache world folds time like a blanket, not to hide the past but to keep it close, to press it against the chest so that it can be carried forward without breaking under the strain of the present. In the high country where the pin-on pine needles crackle underfoot and the thin air tastes of resin and cold stone, each breath is a thread that ties today to yesterday and stitches tomorrow to a horizon that keeps widening as people walk it. The stories here are not museum pieces. They are living coordinates, a map that refuses to stop moving because the land refuses to stop teaching. The elder sits with the patience of a canyon wall, every line on the face a page turned by hands that have learned to wait for the right moment to speak. Their voice comes out in the syllables of long memory, a cadence that makes time feel pliable, as if one could bend it to listen longer, to hear what the land remembers about a rain long ago, about a winter when the rivers became solid glass for a season, about a hunt that required more cunning than speed, more silence than sound. They speak of the places where the sun hits the rock just so, carving a warmth into the heart of the stone that remains after the heat leaves. And they speak of the people who learned to read those lines, as if the mountains themselves had written a language for the living to decipher. It is not simply history as a chronology of events. It is an archive of attention, a practice of listening that asks a person to pause and align their pulse with the slow listening of earth and sky. In the desert, memory wears the color of dust and the scent of creosote after rain. The Apache remember that rain is a guest who must be welcomed with songs and offerings, and so every gathering includes an invitation to the rain to join the circle for a moment, to witness the way the thirsty ground lifts its face toward the sky, as if to beg forgiveness for all the times it forgot that mercy is a kind of water too. Water here is not just a resource but a relationship, a covenant between living beings and the stubborn soil that refuses to forget drought, even when prayers swell and vanish in the heat. A child learns to listen by tracing the sound of distant thunder to the faraway mountains, where the clouds accumulate like stories waiting to be told, and then to listen again as the rain arrives in a soft, steady breath that makes the desert look as if it has exhaled after many years of holding its breath. The world these stories inhabit is a landscape of alignments: sun and moon, season and harvest, hunter and prey, grandmother and granddaughter, all held together by a web of reciprocity. One elder speaks of the kinship that binds a family to a watershed, to the animals that share the land with them, to the cedar tree that shelters a cooking fire and becomes a memory with every scraped rind of bark peeled away to reveal the pale, living wood beneath. The land offers signs, and the people offer respect in return: the careful placement of a stone for a doorway, the precise geometry of a shelter, the softening of language when a name carries a weight of history that could crack a person if spoken without care. The circles are everything: kinship circles that extend to the seasons, to the people who still carry the old ways in a modern world that is not ashamed to borrow what it needs, but is vigilant about paying the proper tolls of memory and responsibility. A thread runs through these chapters like a fiber of living cotton, delicate yet strong enough to bear the weight of 3 generations, and then some. It is the thread of language, a binding that keeps the mouth and the heart aligned when the world seems loud and the ground unstable. Language here is more than words. It is a way of calibrating perception, a technique for listening to the world speak back in 1,000 tiny signs: scent of sage as a guidepost, the particular shape of a cloud watched from a canyon edge, the way a horse's ear tilts toward a distant sound that might be danger or opportunity. In the old storytelling rooms that gather beneath a thicket of branches and the shadow of a stone ring, children learn the vowels of wind and the consonants of rock, then practice them aloud until the valley itself seems to lean closer to hear. The elders correct not to quiet wonder, but to deepen it, to turn curiosity into a discipline, a practice of careful attention that expects the world to keep offering lessons as long as there are listeners who refuse to reduce life to a checklist. Beadwork, pottery, basketry, these are not purely decorative crafts but parametric maps of memory. Each bead strings a moment in time, a decision to be precise and deliberate, a color chosen to carry a particular story or a particular family's voice into the future. The pattern on a basket or a shirt can tell a traveler who belongs to which kinship line, how a clan is related to the carver who shaped the first edge, and what vows were spoken around the ancestral hearth. There is a patience in the weaving that mirrors the patience of the seasons, the time it takes for a seed to become a plant, the time it takes for a river to reclaim its banks after a flood, the time it takes for an elder to finish a syllable that closes a circle and invites the next question to begin. The craft is a pedagogy of time itself, a demonstration that to know a thing well enough to draw its outline on a piece of fabric or a piece of pottery is to have learned to slow down, to treat each moment as a deposit into a personal and communal bank of memory. The landscape gives generously to those who give back with care. A traveler might learn a place by walking the routes that generations of grandparents traveled in youth to retrieve water, to hunt, to gather seeds, to sing the names of the places aloud so that the land can hear a human voice, affirming its continued life. In turn, the land teaches the traveler to accept that belonging is not about ownership, but stewardship, not about possession, but responsibility. There is a way of moving through canyons that respects the life that is hidden in crevices and cracks, the lizards that hide beneath sun-warmed stones, the snakes that glide along the crust of earth, the birds that ride the currents of air like letters across a page. Each creature is a teacher if one has the patience to observe without forcing a lesson, to listen for a resonance rather than a direct instruction. The land itself may be seen as a tutor who points to a future not by demanding compliance, but by inviting a person into a practice of care that becomes second nature with time. To tell an Apache story is to tell a map of the human heart as well as a map of the terrain. The stories cross the lines between the living and the dead, between the visible and the unseen, between the things that can be weighed and the things that can only be felt. They speak of hollowed-out cottonwood trees, where rites were performed, of campfires arranged in a circle that invites the wind to pass around the room and bring with it the echoes of voices long gone but not lost. Of a grandmother's shawl that carries the scent of pine smoke and of rain, a shawl that once warmed a child who learned to calm a fever by tracing the braids and knots that hold memory together. The stories insist that memory is not a solitary possession, but a communal practice. To tell one tale is to invite the neighbors to tell theirs, to place a single thread back into the bundle of many threads that have braided their way into a shared heritage. The politics of survival here are quiet and meticulous, not loud and dramatic. It is the act of choosing what to preserve and what to adapt, of balancing the old rituals with new realities, of learning how to navigate a world in which laws, borders, and technologies move with a speed that makes the old songs feel like maps that need constant updating. The Apache have learned to chart the shifts without surrendering the compass that keeps them orientated toward the land that first gave them breath. Their stories tell of a people who are not waiting for permission to belong, but who are choosing how to belong in ways that honor the past, while inviting the future to stand beside them, not in front of them or behind them, but at their side, offering strength without erasing the path that brought them here. If one stands on a high ledge at dawn and lets the light spill across the vales and mesas, one can hear the sense of responsibility spoken aloud by wind and stone. The land asks for careful stewardship, demands that the next wave of people who pass through it do so with ears open and hands clean, with the humility to ask for consent from the soil itself before taking a single breath or a single fragment of memory. There is a humility here that does not yield to despair but yields to a stubborn hope that the land, with all its surprises and scars, will continue to be available for listening and for learning. The Apache know that to live in a place is to keep a promise to it, that the place will in turn keep a promise to the people who choose to remain. In the circle of drums and voices that gather for ceremonies, the tempo of life accelerates only to slow again at the right moment, when a story lands in the chest, like a seed dropping into soil and taking root. The drum beats carry time forward, yet insist on a pause so that memory can breathe, so that a child can ask an unexpected question and a grandmother can answer, not with a fixed truth, but with another question that opens a wider door. The ceremonies are not relics of a bygone era, but living negotiations with time, agreements with the land that require constant maintenance and delicate attention. They teach that power is not the ability to compel, but the capacity to sustain, to marshal resources, to distribute responsibility, to share the load of knowledge across generations. The natural world remains the most potent tutor, the patient mentor who does not hurry and does not forget. A canyon remembers you if you walk it long enough. The trick is to walk with a pace that allows the rock to speak without being interrupted by hurry. A stream remembers you if you listen for its voice long enough to hear the memory of seasons in its course, to sense the steps of the fish as they navigate the bends, to understand when the water rises and when it falls and what that means for the people who rely on it for life. The land's memory is not a static ledger but a living dialogue, an ongoing conversation in which each listener must learn the language anew as the language itself evolves through use. The Apache have learned to translate the speech of the earth into action, how to plant, how to harvest, how to travel without leaving a scar too deep to heal, how to allocate water to the places where life requires it most, how to rotate crops in relationship to the cycles of rain and drought. There is also a sense of humor here, a light footfall in the conversation with gravity that helps keep the weight of history from becoming a burden. The stories are not solemnities without relief, but living tunes that shift tempo when the mind grows heavy or the heart grows stubborn. A joke might arrive in a moment of shared fatigue, a joke that dissolves fear and invites a return to the work of daily life. The careful patching of a moccasined sole, the mixing of plaster for a wall that protects a kin's memory, the soft laughter that travels across the fire and bonds people to one another. In a way words alone cannot. Humor, like resilience, is a resource, a way to weather the seasons of sorrow and the seasons of abundance, without losing the sense of proportion that keeps a people from becoming overwhelmed by the magnitude of their history. And the land remains the orchestra in which all these instruments play. Its topography arranges the ebbs and flows of life into a score that is read aloud by the elders and performed by the younger generation with the tremor of new hands and the steadiness of old hands, learning to trust that their craft will survive the pressure of time. The mountains hold up the sky and cradle the valleys. The rivers carve their own ethics into the ground, teaching patience to those who would rush to the end of the journey. The seasons unfold their own dramaturgy. Spring's soft green as a preface to summer's heat. Autumn's bright warning that the harvest is near. Winter's quiet as a vow that the story will continue into the next year. When a tribe learns to listen to such a score, life itself begins to feel less like a race, and more like a long, reverent conversation with all that has been and all that will be. In this sense, to speak of the Apache is to speak of a living archive that refuses to be reduced to a single chapter, to a single name, to a single moment of triumph or tragedy. The people carry the complexity of the land within their own bodies, their senses sharpened by long experience, their limbs trained by work and walk, their speech braided with terms that carry the weight of kin and country. The stories they tell do not erase the pains of past injustices, but they refuse to let those pains freeze into a single geometry of grievance. Instead, they situate the injuries within a broader map of healing, where memory's charge is diffused by ritual, where the act of remembering is itself an act of restoring balance between people and place. And because this balance is a living thing, it requires constant nurture, new songs learned from old rhythms, new dances that weave in the future without forgetfulness of the old steps, new alliances formed across borders of different nations and dialects, all of them contributing to a larger chorus that includes the land, the water, the creatures, and the human community alike. If a visitor threads their way through a canyon at dusk, they might glimpse the shimmer of a campfire where stories rise like smoke and settle back into the night with a new shape. The faces of those gathered catch the glow in a way that makes each wrinkle and each line a possible doorway into another tale, and the circle becomes a living gallery where memory is displayed not as relic, but as rehearsal space for future acts. The visitor is invited not to behold a fixed tradition, but to participate in a living continuity, to acknowledge that the past is not static but a partner that keeps pace with the present. The invitation is not coercive, it is generous, a way of saying that to know this place and its people is to become a careful listener who does not presume ownership but accepts responsibility. The land gives what it can and asks for a reciprocal return in the form of care, respect, and humility. If I were to walk alongside the people for a year and listen to the ways they speak with the wind, I would hear that the Apache do not seek to conquer time but to accompany it. They do not lay claim to the landscape in the sense of possession. They enter into a relationship of stewardship, a covenant that binds generations to a shared future in which the land's needs and the community's needs are not enemies but fellow travelers. The songs that travel from one camp to another are a thread across the map, stitching places into a single continuum that can be felt in the rhythm of a drum, the tone of a horn, the cadence of a chant that travels with the breath of a singer and returns with the dew of the morning. In such a world, history becomes a practice rather than a record, a practice of living in such a way that the memory of harm becomes a seed for reform, a seed that, if watered with truth and patience, grows into a more enlightened possibility for all who share the land. The chapters you might imagine as fixed in stone are, in truth, living inscriptions that daily rewrite themselves. The cliff face is a chalkboard of wind and weather, and every storm writes a new line across its surface. The people know this, and so they carry themselves with a posture that sings of accountability and hope in equal measure. They walk with the thick-socked patience of elders. Yes, but they also walk with the curious and eager steps of youth, who understand that the circle stretches wider when it is stepped into with courage and humility. They know that the future, to be held gently, must be refused the impulse to hurry toward an outcome, toward a verdict, toward a conclusion that would pretend to close the book on a living, breathing culture. Instead, they tend the page as one tends a field with steady care, with the humility to accept both drought and nourished soil, with the stubborn belief that the work of healing and growth continues when the sun returns, and again places its light on a landscape that keeps teaching if there are ears ready to listen. As the night deepens, The stars arrive with a quiet assurance, and the stories shift their tone from outward description to inward reflection. The narrators speak of the responsibilities they bear as guardians of memory, of the obligations to the children who carry the future in their hands, of the obligations to the land that risks being misunderstood or undervalued if not treated with the reverence it deserves. It is a grammar of care and a vocabulary of restraint, two attributes that work together so that power does not become a weapon but a tool for protection and growth. In such a grammar, to belong is to participate in a conversation that has existed longer than any single voice, yet continues to welcome new voices with respect and curiosity. And in the listening, a visitor might learn to recognize that belonging is not a state, but a mode of action, a daily practice of choosing to show up, to share the bread of time, to honor the elders' stories, even when they move into figurative rather than literal memory, to acknowledge the land's sovereignty as something to be negotiated with, not something to be dominated. The arc of this story, like the arc of any life lived in careful relation to a place, is improvisational and stubbornly hopeful. It recognizes that wounds can become teachers if allowed to speak their truth without turning the lesson into a weapon. It acknowledges that the past can be honored without freezing it, that tradition can adapt without surrendering its core commitments, that resilience is not merely endurance but the capacity to transform difficulty into something that can carry others forward. It is a narrative that asks a reader to walk with generosity toward complexity, to listen beyond the obvious, to stand with those who bear witness to both the beauty and the burden of memory, to imagine a future in which the land's voice is not drowned out by noise, but amplified by the care of a community that has learned the discipline of listening as a form of courage. And so the land continues to read the people as the people read the land. The cycle of seasons repeats, but each cycle writes a new stanza in a living poem that has no final page. The Apache continue to speak in hues of clay and sky, in songs that travel over the highway and into the canyons, in stories that move from breath to breath with the momentum of a river that refuses to stop flowing, in the beads that catch the light and hold memory steady enough for a child to hold on to when the world feels large and uncertain. The work of living with the land, the daily rituals of care, the careful negotiation with the state and with private interests, the improvisational art of keeping culture vibrant while remaining open to change, goes on. It is not a conquest but an ongoing conversation, not a closure but a commencement, not a conclusion but a continuation, a passage through which tradition and transformation walk hand in hand, neither conquering the other, both enriching the life of a people who insist that belonging to a place means more than residence. It means responsibility, reciprocity, and a shared vow to treat the world as a patient teacher and a generous kin. And so the chapter does not end. It folds into the next moment, the next gathering, the next song, the next map drawn on a hillside, the next breath drawn in a circle that gathers everyone who loves this land and this people into a single continuing story. The trail of memory is long and winding, and the trail of life is even longer, and the two together weave a fabric that is both intimate and expansive, a garment worn not for display but for survival, a cloak that keeps the wearer warm with history and light with possibility. The Apache, in their many nations and communities, carry forward a tradition that is less about resisting time than about guiding time, gently through a passage where tradition and transformation walk hand in hand, neither conquering the other, both enriching the life of a people who insist that belonging to a place means more than residence. It means responsibility, reciprocity, and a shared vow to treat the world as a patient teacher and a generous kin. And so in the quiet, the night air filling with stars and the distant drums still beating, the living story continues, unbroken, always becoming. The land itself holds a patient ledger of weathered names, and each name is a river through time that bends and returns in memory to the people who learn to read it first. The desert does not hurry its stories, and so the Apache do not hurry theirs either. They work within the slow cadence of heat and rain, of dawn light spilling over canyon rims, of winter snows that arrive like a silent counsel and depart with a whisper. If you walk with them through a landscape carved by wind and patience, you begin to hear a language in the land that sounds like the turning of pages in a very old book, a book that never ends and always begins anew in the same breath. In the many nations that stretch across mountains and mesas, the people have a way of naming a place for what it teaches you about yourself as you stand upon it. The mesas give you perspective, They teach you to be small in the presence of something older than memory, and yet not distant from your own beating heart. The canyons teach you to listen to silence, a silence that is not emptiness but a reservoir of possibilities, a room in which every sound has a shadow side and a bright side. The rivers teach you to stay hydrated, not just in the body but in the memory, to drink from sources that have fed generations, to respect the life that springs from the same ground the feet press into the dust. And so it is with the Apache, whose nations, Mescalero, Chiricahuas, Western, Jicarilla, Lipan, and others, carry forward a tradition that does not cling to a single name or a single map. They move through the land as if they are currents themselves, weaving water and wind into a common thread that runs through stories, songs, beadwork, and the quiet diplomacy of living with a place rather than against it. The people have learned over generations to turn the obstacles of history into roots of resilience, to see the past not as a chain that binds, but as a weathered compass that points toward a future still being written in real time. When you walk among them, you hear the sound of language shifting like light in a canyon, D, Apache, Dine, and 1,000 small variations that map the personal histories of families who claim a word not as a possession but as a responsibility. The language is a living thing, a living map that teaches you how to name beauty and how to hold sorrow with the same careful hand. And language here is not only speech but pattern and song, the way a child learns to whistle a tune that a grandmother first sang to a cradle of clay and cornmeal, a tune that somehow carries the scent of pinon and juniper and the distant thunderhead that sits like a promise on the horizon. Ceremony is not merely ritual, it is a way of aligning time with the land's own rhythm. Firelight becomes a teacher, a witness to the continuity of life, its embers a path that traces back to ancestors who stood at the edges of long winters and counted the rings of the world in their own bodies. The drumbeat is not a metronome but a heartbeat, an insistence that life continues, that memory travels with the wind as surely as it travels with a child's step through a family yard. The dancers move with the gravity of a rainstorm. You see them glide, you feel the air tighten, and you sense that the ground itself is listening, attentive to every memory spoken aloud, every prayer whispered beneath a breath that holds the weight of generations. The people carry the land in their waking hours as if it were a woven blanket, each thread a different terrain, a different season, a different kin who walked this same ground before. They have learned to live with drought and flood, with a politics of water that looks more like a council than a competition. Water is life, and life is a circle that includes not just the living but those who came before and those who will come after. A kinship extends beyond what is visible, an invisible network of obligation and reciprocity that binds one family to another and to a landscape that refuses to be owned in any permanent sense, only respected and cared for, kept safe for the time being and for the time that follows. To walk with Apache storytellers is to walk into rooms made of memory. They tell of the old calendars in which the sun and moon counted their days in ways that fit the people's work, the planting, the hunting, the gathering, the sewing of clothing from hides and grasses, the crafting of tools from stone and bone. They show you how a child learns to track by listening to the sounds the earth itself makes when a creature moves through brush, how the elder's eyes learn to read the signs of a season in the way the sky wears its colors at dusk, how every scent in the air becomes a mnemonic device in a living library. They teach you to recognize the difference between a wind that carries blessing and a wind that carries warning, to sense the meaning hidden in the way a cloud bank touches the ridge, to understand that time does not simply move forward but can loop back, offering a chance to correct a misstep, to repair what was broken, to remember what was almost forgotten. In the shadows of the long histories, a modern life persists with its own quiet courage. The people work toward the revival of language and craft with a determination that is at once gentle and radiant. There are schools that teach children in a language that was kept alive, not by museums but by kitchens and campfires, by those evenings when a grandmother's voice would rise over the hush of twilight, and a child would repeat the words with the same reverence with which a seed is planted. Beadwork becomes not merely decoration but a language of its own, a way to tell stories of mountains and rivers, of relatives who walked before, and those who are yet to arrive. The colors, turquoise, coral, black and white shell, the earthy browns of the ground, each hue carries a memory and a promise, a link to the earth that bears responsibility, as surely as the air that fills the lungs of those who listen. The past is not a closed cabinet but a living archive, and the Apache navigate its aisles with the patience of a river that has learned every bend by heart. They speak of treaties and betrayals with measured care, naming the wrongs not to inflame but to heal, to leave a map for future generations that can guide them through the labyrinth of history without dissolving the integrity of who they are. They speak of the long roads that ran through sand and snow to bring them to a place of uneasy rest called a reservation, a word that means a setting aside for a purpose that is larger than a single story, yet must be told by many voices, each one speaking with the gravity of someone who has survived a storm and learned to welcome the light that follows. There are landscapes where the land itself seems to push back against the idea of simplification. The mescalero mesas catch the light in a way that makes the stone look almost edible, as if you could bite into time and taste the weathering that left those grooves in the rock. In such places, the people practice the art of listening in a way that makes listening itself a form of action. They listen to the weather, to the birds, to the way petroglyphs trace shadows on a cliff's face at a particular hour when the sun sits just so, and in listening they act with a deliberation that is not slow but precise, choosing each move with an eye toward keeping balance with a world that would prefer to remain in balance only with itself if given the chance. And yet the world beyond these valleys and plateaus encroaches with a speed that feels like a sandstorm, a modern economy, a new language of policy and media, a flood of imagery that demands easy answers and simple truths. In response, the Apache adopt a method that is both ancient and adaptive. They tell their truth with a clarity that respects the listener's need to understand but without surrendering nuance. There is no desire to reduce a people to a single thread of grievance or to present their history as a linear catastrophe, but rather to offer a living, multi-threaded tapestry in which triumph and pain are intertwined, where humor and sorrow share the same breath, and where the act of storytelling itself becomes a form of survival, a way to keep the memory from being seized by time's eraser. Photography and film have become new instruments through which the living memory can be shared beyond the borders of a valley or a nation. In these modern records, the Apache appear not only as subjects of history, but as agents of history, shaping how their stories circulate in the wider world while maintaining sovereignty over the telling. The images that pass through cameras and frames carry a double weight. They document what has happened and decenter the idea that history is only something that happened to a people. Instead, history becomes something that people do with the world, an ongoing practice of making meaning in a context where meaning is often contested, where identity is not a fixed shield but a flexible instrument for negotiation, resilience, and hope. The land, in turn, remains a patient mentor. It teaches through the season's weather, through the patterns of migration and the cycles of renewal in plant life, through the subtle shifts in animal behavior that come with climate changes, both slow and abrupt. The Apache listen closely for these shifts, not as a call to fear, but as a call to adapt, to maintain a relationship with the world that is neither passive nor domineering, but reciprocal. A farmer prayer is spoken with the same tongue that tells a child how to track a deer, because both teach the necessary humility that comes with recognizing a place's sovereignty, the sense that you are a participant in a drama larger than your own story, asked to contribute in ways that honor the whole ecosystem of life. In conversations across firelight and daylight, elders remind younger voices that belonging to a place is not a privilege to be taken for granted, but a responsibility to be learned again and again. They remind them that the word for land in many Apache tongues is not merely physical space, but a living family with cousins who are rivers, cousins who are winds, cousins who are the mountains themselves, all of whom require respect and care. The kinship is not only among humans but across all beings who share breath and soil, who participate in the same circle of life, even when their ways of being are different and their languages do not always find one another easily. To witness a community steadfast in this care is to witness also the quiet revolution that happens when a people refuses to be erased by the march of time. It is the decision to tell a story in their own words, to map their corridors of memory in a living cartography that invites strangers to walk beside them, to recognize that the road toward a future is not a straight line but a braided path that winds through reverence, humor, and stubborn hope. The landscapes themselves become storytellers, each place a chapter that opens to those who know how to listen. And in that listening a new kind of belonging can be learned, a belonging that welcomes the outsider not as conqueror but as companion, as one who carries with them an oath to see the land as kin, as teacher, and as guardian. The films and photographs that travel outward carry something of the same intention as the stories told around a fire, to invite the audience to participate in a moment of understanding that does not end when the screen goes dark or the camera stops rolling. They seek to transform spectators into witnesses who leave a room with a different sense of responsibility toward the Earth and toward the people who have stewarded it for countless seasons. In this sense, the Apache voice is not merely a record of what happened, but a living invitation to engage with what remains possible when history is met with courage and tenderness, when memory is treated not as a burden to bear, but as a resource to draw upon for future generations. And so the narrative moves with the river's own journey, sometimes a calm reflection, sometimes a fierce surge, always moving toward a horizon that is both distant and intimate. It keeps faith with the complexity of a people who have known both the softness of a grandmother's beadwork and the hard edge of a history that demanded endurance. It holds together the warmth of communal gatherings and the cold clarity of political reality, the quiet humor that threads through daily life, and the immense weight of a legacy that refuses to fade. It asks the audience to hold the tension between what has been endured and what remains to be built, between the memory of loss and the promise of renewal. In the end, the Apache teach us something essential about belonging, that belonging is a practice, not a possession, a daily decision to honor the land by treating every breath as a kind of promise kept. It is the act of listening deeply enough to hear a canyon sigh or a drumbeat echo in the heart, the courage to walk forward even when the path is uncertain, and the humility to know that a person's life is never only their own, but a thread in a larger living fabric that stretches back to the beginning of time and forward into times unborn. If there is a single word to carry forward from their voices, it is not a label or a claim, but a vow to keep faith with the land and with each other, to tell the truth with gentleness, to move through history as through a landscape of open routes rather than a fortress of memory, and to walk in a way that invites all who listen to become a part of the long, unending story that the Apache carry like a lamp through the night, a lamp that illuminates the next step, even when the road ahead remains unseen.